Most people look at Coober Pedy and see the end of the earth, a sun-bleached opal town buried beneath the South Australian desert. A place where trees barely grow, summer temperatures become unbearable, and entire communities escape underground just to survive. But beneath those barren white plains lies a geological story that, for a brief moment in 2013, convinced parts of Australia that the Outback might be sitting on one of the largest oil discoveries on Earth. Over the past few weeks, I kept receiving comments claiming that Coober Pedy was secretly sitting on enormous untapped oil reserves. Some people claimed Australia was deliberately refusing to drill them. Others said the region contained Saudi Arabia levels of oil. So I started digging through old reports, government geological assessments and news articles surrounding the Arckaringa Basin, and that is where things became very strange. On January 24th, 2013, headlines exploded across Australia after the Brisbane-based company Linc announced what sounded like a civilization-changing discovery beneath inland South Australia. Independent assessments commissioned by the company suggested the Arckaringa Basin could contain up to 233 billion barrels of shale oil trapped within ancient sedimentary rocks beneath the desert. At 2013 oil prices, the estimated in-ground value was placed at roughly 20 trillion Australian dollars. Adjusted for inflation and modern pricing, that figure would now sit somewhere closer to 27 to 30 trillion dollars in today's money. For comparison, Australia's entire annual GDP today is only a tiny fraction of that number, and the language surrounding the discovery became even more dramatic. Peter Bond, chairman of Linc at the time, stated that even if the estimates were stress tested right down, and only the absolute sweetest and most proven areas were counted, the basin could still potentially hold around 3.5 billion barrels of oil. But then came the quote that sent the story viral across the country. If you took the 233 billion, well, you're talking Saudi Arabia numbers. It's massive. It's just huge. That single comparison completely changed public perception of the basin overnight. Suddenly, the empty desert north of Coober Pedy was no longer just an opal field sitting beside the Stuart Highway. It was being discussed as a possible future energy superpower. Linc even suggested that if production rates could ever exceed 500,000 barrels of oil per day, Australia could potentially transform into a significant net energy exporter. Any oil field capable of producing 500,000 barrels a day would rank among the largest petroleum operations on Earth. And for a brief moment it looked like Australia may have discovered its own version of the American shale boom. But then something unusual happened. The very next day, ABC News released a second article that completely changed the tone of the story. Instead of celebration, the article carried a warning. It urged Australians not to get too excited about the discovery, stating that it was far too early to determine whether the basin was commercially viable at all. The follow-up piece stressed that the oil in the ground did not automatically mean economically recoverable oil. That distinction became the entire story, because the Arckaringa Basin was never a conventional oil discovery. This was not Saudi Arabia. There were no giant underground reservoirs filled with pressurized liquid crude waiting to gush out of drill holes. Instead, the hydrocarbons were believed to be trapped inside extremely tight shale and mudstone layers buried deep beneath the basin. The oil was effectively locked inside the rock itself. That makes the Arckaringa Basin what geologists call an unconventional petroleum system, and unconventional systems are far more difficult. To extract oil from shale formations, the rock usually needs to be hydraulically fractured or fracked. High-pressure fluid is injected underground to crack the rocks apart and create artificial permeability pathways that allow hydrocarbons to flow toward production wells. Without those fractures, the oil cannot move through the rock economically because shale has extremely low natural permeability. This is where the geology of the region becomes both fascinating and problematic. The Arckaringa Basin is an ancient sedimentary basin stretching across northern South Australia near Coober Pedy and Unconventional. Much of the petroleum interest focuses on organic-rich formations like the Stuart Range Formation and deeper trough systems including the Borthana Trough and Phillipson Trough. Geological studies later confirmed that some of these rocks contain high total carbon values and oil-prone kerogen capable of generating hydrocarbons under the right temperature and pressure conditions. In simple terms, the basin genuinely appears to contain the ingredients necessary for petroleum generation. The source rocks are real and the organic matter is real, and the evidence of hydrocarbon generation is also very real. Government geological reports from South Australia later describe parts of the basin as having excellent oil-prone source potential. So the idea that hydrocarbons exist beneath the region is not internet fantasy, it is legitimate geology. But geology alone is never enough. The real challenge is whether those hydrocarbons can actually be extracted economically, and this is where many unconventional projects fail. Unlike the giant shale basins of Texas or North Dakota, the Arckaringa Basin sits in one of the most isolated parts in Australia. Infrastructure is minimal, water resources are limited, and drilling operations would be extremely expensive. The targets can be very deep, and shale oil only becomes profitable when a huge number of geological factors align almost perfectly. The rock needs to fracture correctly, the pressure needs to be sufficient, the permeability needs to be adequate, the thermal maturity needs to fall within the right window, and the hydrocarbons need to flow at commercially sustainable rates. And perhaps most importantly, oil prices need to remain high enough to justify the enormous development costs. That uncertainty is exactly why the cautious ABC follow-up article appeared only one day after the original announcement. The media realised that enormous oil-in-place estimates were being interpreted by the public as guaranteed recoverable reserves, when in reality the two concepts are completely different. Oil in place simply means hydrocarbons may exist within the rock. Recoverable reserves refer to the fraction that can actually be extracted economically, and in conventional shale systems, that gap can be massive. Many shale basins around the world contain extraordinary quantities of hydrocarbons that may never become commercially viable to extract. The environmental concerns surrounding the project also escalated rapidly. Hydraulic fracturing remains highly controversial due to groundwater contamination concerns, chemical usage, water consumption, and induced seismicity. The ABC follow-up article specifically mentioned rising international concerns surrounding fracking operations in both the United Kingdom and the United States, and those concerns carried particular weight in inland South Australia. Much of Central Australia depends heavily on fragile groundwater systems linked to the Great Artesian Basin. Any large-scale, unconventional petroleum project in the region would face enormous scrutiny regarding water usage and contamination risks. Fracking operations can require millions of litres of water per well, something especially significant in one of the driest inhabited continents on Earth. Then the story began to unravel. Following the initial media frenzy, Linc continued appraisal drilling and exploration work within the basin. Additional seismic studies and exploration programs were proposed. For a few years, the project still appeared alive, but behind the scenes, problems were growing. Global oil prices began collapsing after 2014. Unconventional petroleum projects became far less attractive economically. At the same time, Linc itself became engulfed in major environmental controversies linked to underground coal gasification operations in Queensland. Eventually, the company entered voluntary administration in 2016 before moving into liquidation. And almost overnight, the enormous momentum surrounding the Arckaringa Basin disappeared. The Saudi Arabia comparisons faded from the headlines, the trillion-dollar estimates vanished from public discussion, and the basin entered a strange geological limbo that continues even today. Importantly though, the geology itself was never disproven. No one suddenly announced that the oil source rocks did not exist. Government geological assessments still recognise petroleum potential within the basin. Exploration licenses have continued to exist in various parts of the region. Even today, companies occasionally revisit South Australia frontier basins searching for energy resources, but the narrative has changed dramatically since 2013. Today, far more caution surrounds unconventional petroleum development in Australia. Investors became more sceptical after numerous shale projects worldwide failed to meet expectations. Environmental scrutiny intensified, water concerns became more politically sensitive, and the economics of remote inland petroleum extraction remained extremely difficult. Interestingly, parts of the Arckaringa Basin are now attracting renewed attention for entirely different reasons. In recent years, some companies have shown interest in hydrogen and helium exploration within inland South Australia rather than massive shale oil production. The same deep geological structures that once attracted petroleum explorers are now being reconsidered through the lens of emerging energy industries. So the basin never completely disappeared from scientific interest, but it also never became the next Saudi Arabia. And that is what makes the entire story so fascinating, because the comments people leave online are not entirely wrong. There probably are enormous quantities of hydrocarbons beneath the region. I hope you found this as interesting as I did, and as always, thanks for watching. Before I end this video, I'd like to give a big shout out to my Patreon and YouTube members. Thank you so much to everyone that helps to support this channel.